And today's guest is John T. Harvey. He's a professor of economics at Texas Christian University and author of multiple books on economics, and he's a blogger at Forbes.com. Also, he's on the board of the Association for Evolutionary Economics. I got in touch with John because I have a Google search for bottom up, a Google alert, and he had an article that mentioned bottom up. So I dug up the article, checked him out, and he's an interesting guy, and I think we'll have a lot to learn from him. So thanks for being on the show, John.
Oh, thank you very much.
So you wrote an article last year that made me assume you have tenure, which you checked.
Right.
Because you write 5 reasons you should blame the economics discipline for today's problems.
Yes, and I guess the terrifying thing is that many people in the economics discipline would actually wholeheartedly agree. Gosh, where to start? Well, first of all, okay, let's take something tangible, the financial crisis. And you had many people in mainstream economics saying, gosh, none of us expected this. Who would have thought this could have possibly happened? The Queen, she was visiting London School of Economics, and she said, why did none of you see this coming? And the fact of the matter is, many people did see it coming, but they weren't in the mainstream of economics. They were on the fringes and therefore discounted. The reason the mainstream didn't see it coming was because, and when I say this to people, I feel like I'm a liar because it sounds so outrageous. The primary models that economists use to look at the macroeconomy don't include a banking sector. They don't include the possibility of debt. And because it sounds like I'm lying, when I write a paper about this or when I do a talk, I just let them do the talking. I pull up quotes from the mainstream, from Nobel laureates, from Paul Krugman, who say, gosh, and there was this one quote from Krugman, almost embarrassed, gosh, you'd think we'd have debt in our models, but we don't. And this goes all the way back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith in 1776 is trying to understand the way the economy works, and he bases his analysis on Isaac Newton and his concepts in physics. And when I tell students about this, I say, okay, you have a supply and demand diagram, and so a body at rest stays at rest. It will stay there forever. It's absolutely static. The only thing that can happen is if you disturb the equilibrium, well, then it quickly moves to a new equilibrium point. And I'll put one of my marker pens on the desk.
Stop.
Yeah.
I want to take a step back because I read your article, and I want to kind of just do a summary of what I mean. Basically, the title says it. The economics problems that we have should be blamed on economists and the way economists do things. And just to summarize it, what you're basically saying is that economists are so far off in their ivory towers, so isolated in their silos that they don't address what's real. And they've got these models that there's one model and it's the neoclassicism.
Right. That's the mainstream.
And if you don't write about that, you're not going to get published in the top journals. And if you don't publish in the top journals, then you may not get tenure.
Right.
So they've got this vicious cycle that puts them in this very closed loop so that the science, or can I call it a science?
Yeah, go ahead. It should be a science. It should be.
But it is so disconnected from reality. And you go on in the article to talk about how this model leaves out such basic stuff, and it makes assumptions that are just dumb. It makes you think that, somehow economists have been functioning like fools.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a rough thing to say, but
even within their own school of thought, when you have graduate students coming up, there was a survey done, I think in, 2010, the graduate students themselves in that school of thought don't like macroeconomics. They think it's silly.
Now, what is macroeconomics?
That's going to be unemployment, inflation, GDP growth.
So the big those are focuses of macroeconomics.
Correct. Macro is the entire economy as a whole. Micro is, for example, how does an individual firm operate? Okay. But macro is the whole the whole economy. That's what the Fed's going to be involved with.
So and you need to have some people thinking about to look at the big picture. Now, I've done interviews with Noam Chomsky. I just did one with Peter Joseph, who did the Zeitgeist movies TV video series on YouTube.
Yeah.
And they both talk about externalities. Externalities are the kinds of things that get left out when looking at the big picture.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the way you are indicting the economic field is that they have left massive holes in their theories, creating massive ranges of externalities, like talking about the United States when you're really only talking about east of the Mississippi. and that's shocking.
But as you said, there's nothing that's reining it in. There's no punishment for building models that don't explain anything. Because if they get published, well, then you can have a fantastic career. It doesn't matter that you don't really understand how banks work. So
there's no accountability in terms of measuring economic ideas or theories against the real world.
That is exactly the problem. That there's no, and that goes back to, it goes back to the idea, in mainstream economics, they don't believe that it's necessary to look too closely at real world phenomena to build your premises. That your premises, you should use reasoning and sit and think to myself, well, what would I do if I were a manager? And this is a conscious philosophical choice in terms of how one does science. Do I look outside the window or do I sit and think to myself? There's a famous quote from years ago that said that if economists were asked to study horses, they wouldn't go look at horses. They would sit in their office and think, what would I do if I were a horse? And the idea being that our perception is biased if we look at the rest of the world. Well, your perception is biased if you sit in your office too. And there's nothing checking you.
So I would say a couple things. One, the problem you're describing for economics is one that I think a lot of academic disciplines have as well. It's not just economics.
That's correct.
But the other thing is I call the show Bottom Up, and what you're describing is a very top-down culture. A very
Absolutely.
Top-down system that bottom up in terms of the brain is the raw information that comes in.
Yeah.
Then the brain uses its top-down prefrontal cortex processing to decide what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to. And what's happening with economics is it is so blinded by its process that it's missing all the important stuff.
And they'll even admit this. I have a series of quotes from a paper I wrote recently where they all said, gosh, we don't have any way of explaining the financial crisis because it wasn't, that part of the economy wasn't even in the model. But then they end up concluding, but we're close enough. That, you know, once the I guess the dust had settled, they're like, oh, well, we'll go on with business as usual. It's too hard to change. We've got all these university rankings, all these departmental rankings, and these are all top down as well. And so are you going to be the one at Harvard to say that you will allow your faculty to earn tenure by publishing in not the top journals? You don't want to be the one to be responsible for that, for the ranking to fall. So you just follow the rule. And the rule is, here's the list of top journals. We all try to publish in those. And therefore, we end up with this sort of academic inbreeding where we have the same terrible ideas passed back and forth for years and years.
It makes me think of counting the number of fairies on a pin.
That's right. Well, you know John Kenneth Galbraith. Well, his son, Jamie Galbraith, teaches at University of Texas. And I have my students watch a video from him. And he says that, you know, today the problem is, first of all, he blames the journal ranking system. And then the fact that most economists are simply concerned with their own little puzzles that they're working on. They're not concerned about policy. They're not concerned about macro issues. And why should they? Because they're not rewarded for that. They're rewarded for playing with the puzzles.
Well, now you're on the board of the Association for Evolutionary Economics, is that take a different approach at all, or is it another one that does the same thing?
Well, we like to think that we do the right thing. As a matter of fact, you mentioned economics being a science, and the founder of our school of thought, Thorstein Veblen, had an article back, in the early 1900s, is economics an evolutionary science? Is it a science? And he said, no, it's not. That we are not acting as scientists would act. So we like to think that we're not. The other school of thought I claim is called post-Keynesianism. And in the title of one of our big scholars in America, Paul Davidson, his book from '76 is called Money and the Real World. Real world, real world. It's emphasized over and over and over. We're trying to explain what's outside this window here. We're not trying to just play with math. Now, that's the other thing. They say that economists have physics envy, that they want to look clever. Now, as it turned out, my first major was physics, and so I know how to do math, but
me too.
Yeah, there's got to be a reason for it. There's got to be a reason why. And here's the thing, though. So often, the math becomes very difficult to manage unless you oversimplify the real world. And so that ends up being the problem.
And now, I've gotten into systems theory because
yes,
because basically, the science that does not use systems theory is a top-down, mechanistic, atomistic model that doesn't work to explain complex systems like
that's right,
and subatomic particles and biological systems.
Right.
And so to create a science that would work for them, they had to change the scientific model. And it sounds now I know there's economic systems theory.
Not much. The first article I saw on that was in 1986 by a guy named Mike Redzicki, and it was in one of our institutionalist journals. And Mike was talking about system dynamics theory, which was created by Jay Forrester at MIT. And the idea was that, look, social systems are complex. There are feedback mechanisms, and we have to model these through time. And so I've actually played with some of that myself, doing modeling of an economy over time. Now you get things like cycles. Now you find out why things may be unstable. But you go back to that equilibrium thing. Oh, everything goes there and it stops. No, it doesn't. It worked. If only economics had selected biology as our analogy rather than Newtonian physics. But that was a misstep from the get-go.
So is there a movement within a small group of economics professors to get the hell out of a model that is so broken that it has caused massive suffering? Because the other side of your article is you say there's accountability here. The accountability is not at all within the academic system, where people get away with playing around with models that's has no meaning to the real world.
Right.
But the accountability that happens is that these models that the presidents hire these academic economists and they base decisions on them, and then people die, people suffer, people starve.
Absolutely.
So it's not just a clean, simple ivory tower situation.
Right. It's not English literature, which, as important as English literature is, if I do it poorly, no one dies. But if I do economics poorly, we have a responsibility. Do you know we're one of the few disciplines that doesn't have a ethics statement? Almost every academic discipline has a statement of ethics that every member has to follow. We don't have one.
So again, I'll ask: is there a group that is attempting to change things? I love. Yeah. The quote that one of the quotes that I have on my signature on my emails is from Buckminster Fuller, and it says that you don't change things by directly addressing them. You replace them with something else.
Yeah. And
so it would seem that the way that economics is going to have that happen is some brave group of probably tenured professors.
Yeah.
Is going to have to go. We're not going to publish in those journals anymore, and we're going to create journals that open things up and we're going to base our decisions on how effectively people model reality. Is that happening?
No, it's not. I mean, now we already have alternate schools of thought, and we have had for years, that are following the path that you're talking about. But the main school of thought isn't listening at all because there's no incentive to. Here's the other problem too. There's a self-selection that takes place during graduate school. You know, when I started graduate school and I started learning some of this stuff that I thought, this is ridiculous. I thought about quitting. But then I found a book called A Guide to Post-Keynesian Economics, which I found much more realistic. And I thought, okay, I'll do your stupid PhD program, and then I'll do the research I want to do. Now, I got very lucky. I ended up at a university where I was allowed to do that, where I was rewarded for doing research, not in the supposedly, you know, top journals. I'm doing mine in alternate schools of thought. But so, yes, there's a lot of people working really hard. The man who won the award as most accurately forecasting the financial crisis, most people have never heard of him in the mainstream. He's one of ours. He's a post-Keynesian guy. But you know, there's, again, it's that whole journal ranking thing.
Who won the award?
Steve Keen, Keen. Very nice man, and he's not the least bit shy, so I'm sure he'd be happy to come on the show too. But he's in London right now. But he was using a model, and he used a systems model that he built back in about 92. And then what happened was, this is the middle of a long expansion. And so, but he built a model back then that predicted that when you get to a certain level of debt, the system collapses, a level of private debt. And he was doing some expert testimony in Australia around 2005. And he was going to say the next morning in his testimony, oh, debt has risen exponentially. And he said, you know, I don't know if that's true or not. So he went and looked it up. And indeed, it was true in Australia. He said, well, that's just Australia, though. I'll check the United States. And he checked the United States. It was even worse. The ratio of debt to income for private citizens, for example, in the housing, and for financial institutions had been rising tremendously. And he said, oh my gosh, I need to quit everything else I'm doing and start a web page where I tell people there's about to be a huge crash. And he went back to use his old model and plug the numbers in. And as I say, he won by a wide margin. Now, this vote only took place among those of us who are not in the mainstream. So, you know, they don't know who he is. So no, there's no incentive for people in the mainstream to do something different. Their careers are very comfortable. And anyone who wanted to do something different never finished their PhD. They did something else.
What? Explain that.
Oh, well, when you're going through the program and you see that these models don't make any sense, you quit. Or you go into a different field of mainstream economics. And that's what that survey indicated, that most of the graduate students within that school of thought said that what we are doing in macro makes no sense. That there are important questions, but we're not asking them. So they just don't do that specialization. So you're left over with only the people who are willing to follow, follow that path. And so you either had self-selection out of that area, or there are people doing work that I think is relevant, but nobody knows who they are.
Okay, so we're going to take a break here, and I'm talking to John T. Harvey. He's a professor of economics at Texas Christian University and author of multiple books on economics. He's a blogger at Forbes.com. I'm giving time to insert the bumper for Okay, so my question is, what kind of response did you get from these mainstream economists when you wrote that article? Of course, you wrote it in Forbes.
Right.
Blog. You didn't write it in a journal, but did you get any response from anybody? What kind of response?
I don't know. As you probably well know, you find some of the most hateful people you ever want to look for in the comment section of blogs and so forth. I used to answer every single one faithfully, no matter what name they called me. And I would always be polite, thank you for reading. No, my parents were married when I was born, that sort of thing. And I even had a fellow who runs another blog write a blog on me to say, this is how it should be done. But I ran out of energy. And so I don't even read the comments anymore. I write it. So I very seriously doubt if any mainstream economists really saw it. But if they did, I don't read the comments now. In fact, some of my readers said, please quit reading the comments and responding. We'd rather you just wrote something new than respond to these idiots. So that's my shameful answer there. I guess I should still be reading through all the comments, but I don't. I will tell you this, that there was a time when I still was reading them, that I critiqued the sort of Milton Friedman idea of you print more money, you create inflation. And I pointed out, which is well known in my school of thought, I didn't make it up, I pointed out that actually in the real world, that's impossible. It's impossible for the central bank to print more money than people want, because in our world, money is credit money. That if I want you to have more cash and I'm the Fed, I have to buy treasury bills from you. Well, you have to be willing to sell them. So there's no way to force money on you. At any rate, I got into a conversation with a monetarist economist, a very nice man, and we had a very pleasant exchange. But and this goes back to that whole point of how do we do research and where do we get our premises? He said, well, but it's like when a helicopter flies over. And I said, no. I want you to tell me the specific tool that the Federal Reserve has available that allows them to do what Friedman said. He said, well, it's like when you put logs in a fireplace. I said, no. I don't want an analogy. I want the specific tool. And I swear this is all true. Then he says, well, it's like when you plant trees in an orchard. I said, no, I don't want an analogy. I want what can the Fed actually do? He said, it's like a hot potato. I said, no. And finally he said, I guess we must agree to disagree. And he had no answer. So how do you talk to people like that? I mean, and it was a very pleasant exchange, a very, very respectful one, but he never got what I was trying to say.
This sounds like the kind of conversations that Galileo might have had with people who were talking about berries on the head of a pin. I mean,
yeah. Or you know, having an argument with a creation scientist. Well, you know, if I'm a biologist, we're coming from two different places with a creation scientist versus a natural biologist about what we even respect as evidence. And so that's how deep the divisions go.
Well, I got to tell you, this really pisses me off. And I've kind of thought about this in a vague, nebulous way. You really nail this down.
Yeah.
You make it clear that the economic profession should not be called a science. It should not be called a profession. It's a calling, a religion.
Oh, it's been called a religion. Yes.
Philosophical masturbation.
Yeah.
But it's unbelievable that it has the power and effect that it does. Milton Friedman. I learned about Milton Friedman through Naomi Klein and her book, The Shock Doctrine.
Yeah.
And so I have contempt for the Chicago School of Economics because they've literally sent out their experts to authoritarian regimes and encouraged them to do incredible damage to most of the people in the world. Milton Friedman, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the most evil people in the history of the planet in terms of...
Well, I mentioned that vote where they voted on who was the most accurate in predicting the financial crisis. There was also a vote on which economist do you think was most responsible, and my vote was Milton Friedman. Because he was most responsible because of the intellectual foundation that he laid out. In terms of deregulation, now there are areas of mainstream economics that are done well. Done better. I mean, I'm not a mainstream economist, but macro is abysmal, and macro is the field that would be the one that the president would be calling on, and the Federal Reserve would be calling on, and the one that has the biggest impact on our everyday lives in terms of inflation and unemployment. And I've been thinking, how do you change this? Because back when I was in graduate school, I was very lucky and got invited out to dinner with Paul Davidson and Alfred Eichner, who were two big names in post-Keynesian economics. And I was at University of Tennessee, which at the time was a hub for institutionalist economics. And Ann Mayhew and Terry Neal were from the university, and they were two big famous people in institutionalism. And I mean, I just sat there in awe. These were, all my heroes. And the conversation was so depressing because what they said was, remember back when we thought we could actually make a difference? And I thought, I don't want to hear this. I'm about to be a brand new PhD. And these people that I look up to are saying, yeah, remember back when we thought we might actually be able to fix something and nothing happened. So that was very depressing. But we have a different world today. And I can get a word out to people in a way that was impossible. Well, this was about 1986 or so, impossible back then. And so I have been wondering if perhaps one of the routes we need to take is to start saying, look, at state universities, we're paying those professors to do ridiculous research. And let's make this clear to people, what's really going on, and get the sort of anger that you're feeling to be more general and say, yeah, we need more relevant economic models out there. After all, I'm paying your salary. Why should I do this when you then go on to, recommend deregulating the financial industry or whatever else? But that's in fact, I'm giving a talk at a communications conference in November, and my talk is on how do we communicate this to the rest of the world? How do we actually create change?
So are there other professions that have this solved?
That is an excellent question, and it is something that I tried to look up. I don't know how to Google search for it, but one of the things I was thinking about was, if we do engineering poorly, then bridges collapse. And so people demand, but it's so easy as an economist to say, for example, the financial crisis, oh, it was just something weird happened. And nobody else has sufficient expertise outside of the discipline to debunk that. So I don't know if there's been a place where they have gone so far away from reality, and yet what they are doing is so important. That combination right there.
Well, I'll give you some suggestions. It seems to me that the people who can do this are people who are tenured.
True.
And so I would try to create a listserv or discussion board for people who agree with you, and I would try to find them and create an organization that has its own journal, and then start using that and go after the big ones and get media and let the media know that the people who are throwing our economies into the trash can have a model that is not based on reality, that doesn't include jobs. Because that's one of the things you said, was that this prevailing model, this neoclassicism model, doesn't even include jobs.
Well, it assumes that they'll automatically come up. It assumes that they're automatically created. We don't that the economy tends towards full employment, is what they say, automatically.
And you say in the article how during the Great Depression people just didn't want jobs.
Yeah.
That's how
that's the Friedman article. The Friedman explanation of the Great Depression is that prices fell, so firms had to lower wages, because they couldn't sell for as much. But then workers didn't realize that prices had fallen, but they did know that their wages had fallen, so they quit. Well, this is insane.
Yeah.
Now, if you backed Friedman into a corner, he would have said, well, no, I know that's not really true, but it doesn't matter, because good economics creates a good prediction. The way it predicts it doesn't matter, which my school of thought absolutely, totally disagrees. If you think that your car, when you push down the gas pedal, drops down little pellets for the hamsters to run faster, then okay, that'll operate just fine while the car's working okay. But then when your car breaks down, you end up taking it to a veterinarian, and they can't fix it, because that's not the way it really works. As I say, I was at a party Saturday night, and people were asking questions, and I felt like a liar, because who could possibly imagine that Nobel Prize winning economists are using models that don't include a financial sector, because it's too hard to model. If you use a systems model, you can do it, because systems model involve the passage of time. But if you think about the way debt works, we have to understand time. You incur debt today, then you repay over time. And so this equilibrium thing where everything stops, debt doesn't fit well. So what do? Do we change our tool? No, we just ignore that it happens.
Well, it makes me realize that why economists don't have a code of ethics.
Yeah. I have a friend who I think would actually make a very interesting guest, George DiMartino, who has been working he's at University of Denver, working for some time on seeing if we could create a code of ethics, and has really uncovered some fascinating things about the nuts and bolts of how policy takes place, and how horrific it is, even for the individuals. Because most economists, they want to do good. That's why they did this. They want to help fix the world. And so these aren't evil people, but they have a bad model. But anyway, George has written about that.
they're stuck in a system that is pure crap.
Yeah, yeah.
So look, we got it. We've only got so much time, and I want to talk about this stuff. I call the show Bottom Up. You've looked at some of my thinking about it, and you have some ideas about bottom up. I want to start off. You wrote an article, the one that I found you with, talking about the good, bad, and ugly of the current tax idea that is circulating, which is nothing new, really. It's kind of the Republicans' wet dream.
Right.
Get rid of taxes for corporations, or chop them, and chop taxes for consumers, but really most of the money to the plutocrats and the very wealthy. And what I think is the worst, most dangerous one of them all, get rid of the inheritance tax. And I call the estate tax or inheritance tax the dynasty tax, because for me, the estate or inheritance tax prevents, or at least increases the power of dynasties, these incredibly wealthy people handing their money over to their children who didn't deserve it, who ended up being born on third base, and claiming that they've been masters of the universe, like the supreme narcissist on the planet. I'm not even going to say his name.
Yeah, and there's been lots of research that shows, you know what makes a successful entrepreneur? That you were born rich. That helps a lot. That's a significant factor, because you have the money to actually take chances. You have the money to lose money as well. But yeah, you're exactly right. And, one of the examples you use, I think the opening example in your chapter on economics, is talking about the bank bailout. And back after the financial crisis, why on earth, the logic seems so simple. Why on earth would you bail out the banks and not the debtors? Because the irony is that, let's say you had given that same amount of money to the debtor. Let's say A owes B. Okay, do I give the money to B or do I give it to A? Let's give it to A. And then A passes it on to B, because we can still bail out the banks that way. But now both slates are wiped clean. But what we had instead was we had A still owing all this money. We have a class of consumers now who can't spend anything, not to even mention what's happening with college loan debt, where we have these people coming out who should be active consumers driving the macroeconomy, but instead they're weighed down by all this debt. So no, I mean, absolutely profits come from the bottom up, that you need to have an active consumer class that are creating the demand for the goods and services being produced by those at the top. And ironically, go ahead.
An article on taxes, you say that a capitalist economy runs from the bottom up, from consumer to producer. Explain what that means.
Well, let's say that you have a restaurant that, I think I used this example in there. You have a restaurant that's half full, and we're in the government, and we can do some sort of a tax relief plan. I can either cut the taxes for the owner of the restaurant, but then do I hire more staff? Why would I hire more staff? I need customers. Or I can cut the taxes of the customers, who then come to the restaurant, which then forces the entrepreneur in a positive way to hire more staff and then earn higher profits. So, if the entrepreneur is going to make more money, I need to help their customer rather than them. And I mean, that's the basic idea.
And I would say that the bottom-up way to do it would be for the government to issue vouchers to consumers that they could spend with businesses. And the money wouldn't even go anywhere unless it got spent.
Yeah. Well, and that's another problem with the increasing the tax credits, for example, with the current plan. Well, if I'm poor, I don't owe any taxes anyway. I mean, so that doesn't really help me. It helps the middle class. But, if you're going to say, I'll tell you what, rather than give you a tax deduction of $5,000, we'll give you a check for $5,000. Now, that makes a difference to the poor. And they're going to go out and spend it. And they're going to go, and this is, all of it. Exactly. They're going to spend all of it. The top 20% of income earners spend like 60% or 70% of their income. All the rest of them added together spend about 90. We want them to have the money, not the people at the top. Gosh, the problem is so bad that even the Republicans, at least during the campaign, were openly acknowledging the destruction of the middle class. And what happened to it since then, I don't know. But
Now, you also have a take on cutting taxes for corporations, big ones and smaller ones.
Yeah, and this may be less economic than, well, for the big ones, they don't need a tax cut. You know, the idea was, well, we'll cut their taxes and they'll bring business back to America. No, they won't. They're not in Indonesia because of the low taxes. They're in Indonesia because you can pay somebody a nickel a day to do something. So, you know, cutting taxes is going to do no good whatsoever to bring this business back to America. I found some data on how much Ford, it's mentioned in the article, how much Ford pays a worker in Detroit, which is about $40 an hour, versus Mexico, which is about $5 an hour. Now, tell me what kind of tax cut is going to cause Ford to bring that back. Yeah, it's impossible. Now, on the other hand, you know, the small entrepreneur, they're struggling. And these are people who are taking big risks. I think there's a little historic town nearby, and down in the square, there's, you know, gift shops and that sort of thing. These are people who have put their lives on hold to do this and have risked their family fortunes. I got no problem giving them a tax cut. Now,
and the other thing is all the job creation comes from the small businesses too.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's also where the job destruction comes from, because they're the first ones to go under when we go back down. But when we come back up, they're the ones to add people. So absolutely, if we really want to help jobs, then we help the consumer and we help the small entrepreneur. But Exxon doesn't need any help. Ford doesn't need any help. I mean, in fact, if anything, you know, under Reagan, we basically stopped enforcing antitrust laws. And so we have ended up with such terrible concentration of power at the top that I don't know how we fix it now.
And then getting back to the estate tax, right now, I think the estate tax is you're basically exempt on the first $5 million as an individual, and I think 11 million as a family.
Huh.
And so getting rid of it would only benefit the very wealthy. And
Absolutely.
How would that affect the economy?
Absolutely, yeah. It will have no real impact whatsoever on the economy. It is certainly, if we really are concerned about income distribution, as both the Democrats and Republicans recognized during the campaign, then the last thing we would do is you know, get rid of the estate tax. It's not like there's something that it's holding back. Oh, if only we got rid of the estate tax, then people would spend more money. No, they wouldn't. As a matter of fact, we're more likely to spend the tax money that we pull out of that. The rich don't spend a lot of money, which is fine. You know, do what you want to do. I'm not telling them that they should, but they have so much money that they don't really. And here's something else. People confuse the word investment. But the rich invest. No. The rich buy stocks and bonds. That's not investment. That's saving. It's financial investment, which unfortunately we use the same word as we do for, say, building a restaurant, which we also call investment. But in economics, we generally don't call buying stocks and bonds investment in a strict sort of academic setting or scholarly setting. That's saving. That's a way of not spending your money. And, you know, you buy a share of Walmart. How much money does Walmart get from that? Nothing. They sold that share years ago. You're just passing it back and forth among people. So no, the rich do not invest.
So my son has this theory that what should be done is that money that's not in use, money that's in savings banks, money that's in stocks should be taxed. Did anybody do that? Anybody talk about that?
Keynes, and Keynes talked about it. By the way, Keynes and Keynesian are not the same thing. And that takes a long time to explain, so I won't bother with that. But I'm a follower of Keynes. I'm not a Keynesian. But Keynes actually talked about that with respect to international economics, that when you have a country like Germany that is continually sort of bleeding the rest of Europe dry by purposely trying to generate these trade surpluses, either they spend it or they lose it. Now, I haven't heard it on a domestic level. I don't know that you know, that nobody has said it, but he did say on an international level that savings should be taxed.
Well, that, like, for example, Apple, I think, has $300 billion in money put aside.
Yeah.
I should tax it. I mean, I love that idea, actually. You know, and one of the things that I've written a lot about is the idea that billionaires should be illegal. It should be illegal to become a billionaire.
Yeah.
And if you are one, you got to get rid of it. And
Yeah.
you can't have that much. And we should start looking at billionaires as abnormal, bizarre, sick, hoarder monsters. And
Right.
giants. In nature, giantism is abnormal and really lethal, too.
And you mentioned in your chapter on economics, democracy and democratization being very important. And I wrote a Forbes thing on Bernie Sanders, what he called himself, a democratic socialist. Well, he's a democratic capitalist because he was not in favor of taking over the nationalizing business. He was in favor of reintroducing competition and getting rid of these, huge corporations and so forth, so that we introduced what capitalism was supposed to be, and that was a system that diffused power rather than concentrated power. Capitalism doesn't work well when power is concentrated. The whole point is to have these firms in competition with each other so that they please us. So democratization is very much an important part of what we should be doing in the economy in order to restore our strength.
So I'm going to ask you in a minute what advice you would give to Bernie Sanders. But first, I'm going to put a station ID in here right now and just pause for a second for station ID. You've been listening to John T. Harvey. He's a professor of economics at Texas Christian University. He's an author of multiple books on economics, and he's a blogger at Forbes.com. So, what advice would you give to Bernie? How should he do it? What's the best way to address economics?
Well, fortunately, I don't have to advise Bernie because a friend of mine was his chief economist, and that was Stephanie Kelton. And Stephanie's in the same school of thought as me. And that's why I was so excited about his campaign, because for once there was an economist who knew what they were doing, who was going to have the ear of the president. And she very much would be in favor of the idea that we reintroduce the regulations of the financial industry, that we grow from the bottom up, that we increase the incomes of the poor, and that we create jobs, that the way the government does deficit spending right now is very inefficient. It's kind of like trying to fill a bucket by putting on your sprinkler. Well, why don't we just get the hose and pour it in? Because the government tries to create jobs by indirectly stimulating the private sector. Just make a job. Do like they did in the New Deal. We need parks. We need dams. We need these. There are so many things that are not profitable, so the private sector wouldn't do them, but they are of social benefit. So we should have the poor doing those things. That's what they want to do. They want to work. So Stephanie Kelton would have been an outstanding, chief of economic advisors, and that opportunity is lost. Now, if I was going to give him a piece of advice, it would be to stop calling himself a socialist, because Americans don't know what he means by that, and there's no point in, if you explain his policies without using that word, you get people saying, "Oh yeah, that makes sense." But as soon as you put that word in there, they're upset. Well, perhaps in a more pure sense, we should say, well, you shouldn't be upset by that, but they are. So don't bring it up. Don't even say it.
So you say that there should be more bottom-up economics in terms of what he should be doing. And that means, I think for you, bottom-up economics means getting money to the consumer, who will spend it, and it'll trickle up.
Right.
And really, trickle-down theory is, I just think it's really urination. It's not, it's pissing on people, and it's not helping people at all.
That's right. There's a line in the movie Outlaw Josie Wales. At one point, I can't remember the actor's name, but he says, "Don't piss down my back and tell me it's raining." And that's exactly how I feel about that.
So it seems to me that there are these crazy, we're stuck. We're really stuck. Now, what about alternatives to capitalism?
Well, there isn't just one brand of capitalism, for that matter. So you don't necessarily have to have an alternative to capitalism. And what do we mean by that term anyway? What is the essential difference? I guess private property at the most basic level. But I explain to people, in my school of thought, we view the market system as a tool, in the same way that a carpenter views a hammer as a tool. And in some contexts, the hammer is the perfect tool to use. In other contexts, you'd rather use the saw. But even then, there are different varieties of hammers. And so you have to remain flexible. Your goal has to be democratic in terms of making sure the average person is taken care of and they have agency over their lives. And so, what would have been a good way of running the economy 200 years ago is not the same as today.
What about, I'm always interested in indigenous cultures.
Yeah.
How do indigenous cultures work in terms of their economies? I know there's a gift economy.
Right.
But how would you see the average, what we know about indigenous cultures? What kind of economies do they have? Economies existed since the beginning of life, really.
Right.
But
absolutely,
economics, you told me before we started in 1776 with Adam Smith.
Right.
So what are indigenous economics? How do they function?
Well, first of all, you're lucky you're not talking to a mainstream economist, because I know the answer to that question, because they actually taught me that in graduate school. The evolutionary economists actually teach anthropology. And Thorsten Veblen used to publish in anthropological journals. So the idea was that you had reciprocity, and that in that case, I'm going to give you something, and there is no formal contract here, but it's something. I gave you part of the elk. You're going to give me part of a headdress or something like that.
Now, what I just interviewed Peter Joseph, and he was saying that when the explorers came to the United States, some of the indigenous people gave them something.
Right.
And the explorers thought, well, I'll give you this back. And that offended the indigenous people, because they had a gift economy and they didn't want anything back. And to have reciprocity was insulting.
Well, it depends on now the reciprocity doesn't have to be in the same time period. If I give you something today and you give me something back today, that might be insulting. But if I give you something today for having interviewed me or whatever, thank you very much. And then sometime in the future, we're in a situation where you want to honor me with a gift, then it has to be the sense that the gift is to honor you and to honor our relationship, not I want something back. So I assume that was the problem, is that the sense that the indigenous people got was, but I gave you that to honor you, to establish a relationship. I didn't give it to you because I wanted something, and that's an insult. And you also have redistribution in these cultures where, the story of Joseph in bondage in Egypt, that he has these dreams, and the Pharaoh hears he's having these dreams, right? And so he brings him up and says, well, what are your dreams about? I've dreamt of, the Pharaoh says, I've had a dream of, 10 fat cows followed by 10 skinny cows. And Joseph says, that's 10 really good harvests followed by 10 bad harvests. Well, the way the Egyptian economy worked was everyone turned in their grain. And then the Pharaoh gave it back out. So it's a redistributive economy. And so what the Pharaoh did was he didn't give everything out in those 10 good years. He made sure they held on to something for the 10 poor years. But there's no market system there. This is an idea of we have a social problem here. And what we're going to do is we're going to solve this just like we actually really do with situations like Hurricane Harvey, which unfortunately bore my name, that the rest of the country was basically bailing out people down there who have nothing. And that's okay. I mean, we're generally all right with that. And so that was a really important part of economies, indigenous economies, is that the market was not really important at all. The market didn't play a big role. A lot of tradition in terms of, what job do I take in my life? And
I need you to take a step back.
Yeah.
I'm not clear what you're saying is what the overall big picture of an indigenous economy is. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, no. So honestly, okay, what's economy? It's production of goods and services and the distribution of those goods and services. So what goods and services do we produce in, say, a Native American tribe? And I'm afraid my daughter would kill me. She's getting her PhD in linguistics in indigenous languages. And so she knows a lot more about this than I do. But I'm going to do the 1950s TV version of what an indigenous tribe looks like. We've got people going off and hunting, all right? And we've got, women in the tribe making clothes and killing small game, that sort of thing. Well, did you apply for that job? No. This is tradition. This is just what we do, how we split the jobs up. Is there unemployment in this tribe? Here's my resume. I have killed 6 elk, this sort of thing. That's wonderful. When we have an opening, we'll let you know. No. That doesn't work that way at all. The social bond is so much more important.
Zero unemployment in an indigenous group.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're going to take
billionaires. There are no equivalent of people who hold 50% of the assets of the group either.
No, that's right. I don't know enough about different indigenous groups to say. I don't know how it worked. And, again, I'm working with my 1950s version of what, they show as an Indian tribe. But, what they're going to end up doing is there'll be tradition as far as if I killed the elk, and this is coming from Thorstein Veblen too, if I killed the elk, then I get to have the first cut of meat. And that's our rule. Now, we're not starving, so it's not like it's really about who's going hungry and who isn't. We're all eating. But it's an honor, again. I was the one that did it, and then maybe the chief gets the next cut, and then, on down. Usually, oftentimes the women and children will get the last cut, but they're not. It's not like it's an honor thing. It is not. Gosh, we need to go out and work 9 to 5, or we'll all starve to death. It's not that. From what I understand from anthropologists, we solved the economic problem fairly easily in those times, and that most of our time was spent in socialization, which of course is the exact opposite that we do now.
Yeah, well, indigenous people work 3 hours a day.
Yeah, that's right. And even then, working in a way that is much more cooperative. That's something else you mentioned in your book, is that rather than competition, we should be allowed to cooperate. Why don't we use this as this is a whole thing that the feminist economists talk about, that the whole model of mainstream economics is a very masculinist framework. Oh, we're in competition. It's survival of the fittest.
So we're going to have to wrap in a couple of minutes. You mentioned your model. What is the name of your model of economics again?
Well, I follow two. One is post-Keynesian, which actually is the economics of Keynes, which is, I pointed out, it's not the same thing as just Keynes. Paul Krugman's a Keynesian, but he's actually a neoclassical. Then the other one is institutionalist. And that's the school of thought coming from Thorstein Veblen.
Is that systems?
Actually, that's the place where I've seen it mentioned the most. I think I'm the only one who has ever published an article in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics that used systems analysis, but it's a very natural fit. The problem with the system analysis is that it's so hard to explain your model to someone else because it gets so complicated so quickly. So
my phone, even though I turned it on at disturb. So, okay, we're going to have to wrap. How do you want to finish up here? What do you got to say?
Something about that we need to fix the economics discipline because they're killing us. And so, we need to find some wedge somewhere, some leverage to be able to make a real change, or nothing's going to be fixed.
Okay. Been listening to John T. Harvey. He's a professor of economics at Texas Christian University and author of multiple books on economics, and he's a blogger at Forbes.com. Okay, so that's going to be the end of the show that goes on the radio. Okay, but any more that you have to say about bottom-up economics based on, you said you had some thoughts from what you looked at in the chapter that I have on it?
Yeah, it made me think of, the sort of whole bottom-up thing. It made me think of how our discipline is so top-down. It crushes creativity. And if we don't find a way to fix that, if we don't find a way to allow people to build models that actually explain the real world and then also get them published, then we're really screwed. I don't know what to do. I don't think that any policymaker is ever going to take a policy from somebody's Facebook status. It's going to be from academic literature. It's going to be from economists. And so if we can't get a movement started to where we have the economists themselves doing various creative things and also being accepted and being able to get tenure and promotion and so forth, if we can't get rid of this whole the journal ranking thing, which is very top down and very dogmatic, then we're in big trouble. But I'm by nature an optimistic person, and yet my brain tells me everything's stacked against us. But I'm going to give it a shot. We'll see how it works out.
I hope you do.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. It's been a great interview.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad we worked out our technical difficulties.
Yeah.